Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Tamer El-Sheikh. First, we acknowledge that Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Gonyanghaga Nation is recognized as the custodian of the lands and waters we now call Montreal. Tiohtià:ke is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it's home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples in the Montreal community. Tonight, very excited to say we welcome Saelan Twerdy to the Sika series. Saelan, besides being my favorite critic, period, is a Montreal-based writer, editor, and a PhD candidate in art history at McGill University. His academic research focuses on the notion of dematerialization in art since the 60s, especially in relation to labor and information technology. He is currently the managing editor of Rakhar. This is a very recent gig, right? Congratulations on that. And amazing to see you at the helm there. It's going to make a difference. I'm not the editor-in-chief. Managing editor is close enough to the helm for our purposes. The official journal of the University Art Association of Canada. Since 2014, he's been a contributing editor at Momus, and his writing has appeared in venues such as Canadian Art, C Magazine, Border Crossings, Black Flash, and The New Inquiry. He has also contributed to books and exhibition catalogs published by Concordia University's FOFA Gallery, Fogo Island Arts, Sternberg Press, and the Museum of Contemporary Canadian Art, now MoCA, in Toronto, among others. Please join me in welcoming Saelan.
So thanks for coming, everybody. First, I want to say thank you to Tamer for inviting me and for the generous introduction. I feel quite honored to be here as an art critic, because I know that this series is usually dedicated to artists and also sometimes to curators. But I feel like as a critic, I'm often kind of the last category of person that gets invited to things. So I'm always pleased to be included. And I also, being able to talk in this series gives me an opportunity to do something that I never really get to do, which is talk about myself, because I'm usually writing about other people, which I love to do. But it is a pleasure and a privilege to be here with you today. This stack of books is not something I'm recently working on, or even it's a stack of books that's sort of representative of like my, maybe my formative years, as it were, which is kind of what I'll be talking about today. So yeah, the title of my talk and the topic of my talk is How I Became an Art Critic. So depending on how much time this takes, I might eventually get to talking about what I write about as an art critic and what I've been focused on for the last several years, but the primary meat of this talk is actually how I came to be doing this in the first place. So hopefully you find it interesting. This is a picture of the city where I grew up, Abbotsford, British Columbia. Abbotsford is actually not a small town. Has anyone ever been to Abbotsford, BC? Hey, wow, so many of you, weird. Okay. Well, Abbotsford is outside of Vancouver, but it's about an hour and a half east of Vancouver, depending on how fast you're driving. It is not accessible to Vancouver via public transit. So technically, it's what you would call an exurb, which is the worst of both worlds, because it has all of the downsides of a suburb and all of the downsides of a small town. And it doesn't have, at least in a suburb, for example, a suburb can be boring, but you usually have fairly easy access to a major urban center, which is not really the case in Abbotsford. You have to drive or take the Greyhound bus, which soon you won't be able to take anymore at all, maybe even right now, which is quite problematic for a lot of people. But anyway, Abbotsford is not a cultural destination, though I should say that it has a contemporary art museum today that's been there since 2008, but it was not there when I was growing up. I moved away from Abbotsford in the year 2000. And so yeah, In my memory, Abbotsford is defined by its very strong presence of evangelicals. I grew up evangelical. My family went to church. I was quite religious. And also its drug problems, which is not a joke. So, yeah, I lived in the exurbs. I had no older siblings, and my parents didn't, they were not really interested in art. So essentially, I grew up in kind of a cultural vacuum, which I think has actually been very influential on sort of my desire for culture in my adult life. So how was I exposed to art and culture as a young person? My parents mostly listened to Christian music, as I did myself growing up, and they didn't really read a lot. My grandmother was a fairly big reader. She was very into New Age, but she had an amazing collection of science fiction literature. She got me into William Gibson when I was like a preteen. And she also had a fantastic collection, which I only came to appreciate kind of later in life, of like 70s synthesizer music and ambient records, some new age ambient records that are really deep classics now, actually. So yeah, it's largely like thanks to her that I sort of had some kind of intellectual influence in my youth. But yeah, that intellectual influence was mainly reading a lot of sci-fi. So I was kind of a classic nerd. As far as art goes, my grandparents were again quite influential, but only to the extent that they had prints of art in their house, especially German art like Albrecht Dürer, who I still love to this day, and coffee table books like Art Treasures of the Louvre, which, let's be honest, as a very small, as a preteen, whatever, I was primarily interested in for the nudes. But I saw some art in that venue. So what did I do with my time? Mostly I played video games. And from an early age, probably around the age of 10, I was a very avid, even obsessive reader of video game magazines. So in a certain perspective, that was my first exposure to the art and practice of criticism. And that's not really a joke, in a way. I learned some things about what criticism does from reading video game magazines as a preteen and a teenager. Video game magazines, especially in my youth, and today still, are like an enthusiast press. They exist primarily to promote the products, and they're full of like strategies and cheat codes and stuff. But being the nerd that I was thirsty for more than that. And so I read magazines like Game Fan, which billed itself as the last true enthusiast magazine, which also included, interestingly, Game Fan also had reviews of albums, and its editors also had a burgeoning interest in anime. But beyond that, I also started reading, and I considered myself kind of a video game snob, because I was reading Next Generation magazine, which was not only about the games themselves, but about the game industry. I wanted sort of to see the bigger picture in that sense. And so aside from playing a lot of video games, I was also extremely online from a young age. And so I was born in 1982, so the internet was not available when I was a child, per se. But as soon as it was a possibility, I started bugging my parents to get the internet in the house, which was when I was maybe 14 or 15. For those of you that remember dial-up internet, it was ugly and slow. But I spent a lot of time in chat rooms and on ICQ. I quite vividly remember somewhat later in my high school years, ICQ would have a little ding every time you got a message, unlike, most of today's direct and instant messaging software, and you could change what the sound was And at one point, I changed it to a little clip from Dr. Dre's The Next Episode. So it would just go, smoke weed, smoke weed, smoke weed every day. But I couldn't leave that on there for very long because of my Christian parents. So yeah, I spent a lot of time on the internet. And the internet really became a gateway to experience beyond the very sheltered world that I was living in. And a real watershed moment for me was the introduction of Napster in 1999. It was really, I really can't overemphasize the influence that Napster had on me, but just file sharing in general, because it made it possible to access music. And I didn't have any older siblings. I wasn't cool, and I didn't even know anyone that was cool. I went to a Mennonite high school, MEI, in Abbotsford, the Mennonite Educational Institute, which in many ways was a very good school. It was very clean. The teachers were quite qualified, but it was very limited in its purview of the kind of world it would expose you to. So anyway, Napster was perfectly timed because this was sort of in my later years of high school. I was developing an interest in music. I spent a lot of time, my art class was very important to me at this point, and I had a really nice art teacher. But I started making friends with people that had much cooler interests than me. And so they started to introduce me to subcultural scenes that I was completely ignorant of up to that point. And so I started much more actively seeking out music and looking for music. And basically at the exact same age that was happening to me, Napster came out. And so I was able to suddenly access any music I wanted, essentially, insofar as I knew to look for it. Even though it would take maybe an hour to download a song, and they were all badly tagged, and I wasn't necessarily even downloading proper albums per se, but it was a really major thing in a lot of ways. I also, concurrently with that, have really clear memories of the first time that I ever read a music magazine. It was in the summer after I had graduated from high school. Which is much, much later than I think most people would have encountered music magazines. Up until then, everything I knew about music was from actually the internet and just from people I had spoken to. I had never, up until I was 18 or something, I had never read a music magazine. And I saw a copy of Spin at a friend's house, and this was actually the issue that I saw. It had a feature on the top 90 or 99 albums of the 90s. And so Spin is not really a terrific magazine, and even then it wasn't the best. But it completely blew my mind because I just had this sudden sensation, actually kind of humiliating, horrifying awareness of all of this stuff that I didn't know. But then this huge excitement of I could know it. I have access to this whole world of information and lore that I could accumulate. And so what was on offer there was not just a richer experience of music itself, but in a way, kind of a whole new relationship to culture for me. The writing with all of, the subcategories and specialized descriptions that apply to music criticism seemed as exciting to me as the actual albums I was reading about that I had never heard of. And so, in a way, reading video game magazines had kind of prepared me for that. But video games were nerdy, from start to finish. That's kind of the point of them. But getting into music offered a whole other level of, the idea of this kind of a press, this kind of criticism, offered a connection to a much broader and more interesting world with more cultural capital. And so I left Abbotsford, I moved to Vancouver, I started at UBC. And throughout my 20s, I became music obsessive almost simultaneously with becoming a wannabe music journalist. In a way, I would say that I almost got into music because of and even for music criticism. It was the criticism that I was really interested in. And I would say, and I'm not necessarily proud to say this, that there was a part of me that really just craved the cultural cachet that I had never had in my life up to that point. That if I could become the critic, not only would I be cooler than I had been before, but I could potentially get to be the person who decided what was cool and what wasn't cool. And so I had, a not entirely noble craving for authority. But at the same time, as I learned about underground music and DIY culture and the sort of independent scene as it existed, I began to see it as a kind of ideal community. Eventually, I would learn that, like so many other things, it was also rife with racism and sexism and exclusion, but it kind of took me a while to get to that level of awareness. At university, I studied film and I studied art history while I was spending basically the entire decade publishing album reviews and interviews with bands. I started writing for CITR, the UBC college radio station, had a magazine, still has a magazine, called Discorder that I wrote for a number of years, as a volunteer, of course, because you don't get paid for doing that. I believe that I had something in this issue that my friend Merrick edited, though not the cover story. So I spent quite a long time writing about music. In university, I took a year of humanities fundamentals in a program they had and still have at UBC called Arts 1, which was a really great program. It's kind of like any sort of introductory humanities. It's sort of a combination of English, history, and philosophy, where I read my Marx and Freud in the first month and got introduced to the history of the Western intellectual tradition and criticisms thereof. In my second year, I applied to the film program. I had this idea that I could get into film production, and probably, thankfully for everyone, including myself, I didn't get in. But I had taken an elective, the sort of classic introduction to art history from the pyramids to Jackson Pollock, and I had really liked it, and I did pretty well in that class. So I decided to just major in art history, and I got a minor in film studies. And at the time, I really had I had no clear idea what I was going to do with that. I really thought of myself as somebody who wanted to be a music journalist, actually. So what I was learning in university was just kind of, in my mind, like background for that. And my exposure to art, actually, was almost entirely through the classroom. I did very little, in my undergrad anyway, visiting of galleries and museums. I was really not cognizant of the art scene in Vancouver, such as it was, until very close to the end of my degree. One thing I did do was I volunteered at the New Forms Festival, which in its early years was very focused on new media and net art. And that was kind of formative in a way that it exposed me to that world, though my experience volunteering was pretty disappointing because almost all of the artwork that was at the festival didn't work. There was really like widespread technical difficulties, and I was like, new media art, okay. I have retained an interest in art and technology up into the present. But anyway, so this photo on the right is from and while writing music journalism, I eventually got a job at a record store, Zulu Records on Kitsilano, in Kitsilano on 4th Avenue in Vancouver. Here's my old coworker Melanie holding the Destroyer album that I played a song from at the beginning of this lecture before it started. Melanie also is in contemporary art these days. She works at the ICA in London. I contributed to Discorder for free for a bunch of years, and then I eventually got a staff gig at a weekly paper in Vancouver called Terminal City. My first paid piece of music writing was an interview with the musician Ariel Pink, who I subsequently interviewed a couple of times for other publications. The thing about being a music journalist and working at a record store at this sort of point in history is that the factors that made it possible for me to want to do that, i.e. File sharing and the internet, actually eventually, in the same time that I was getting involved in them, was destroying the infrastructure of the music industry and record stores and music magazines. It was, if not destroying it, then transforming it really radically. So even the sort of cultural cachet that I was craving from being adjacent to these scenes was also being really democratized by the internet, which made it less and less significant to have the sort of like elite cred you would get from obscure knowledge, because the knowledge was just so much easier to access, or at least it was by the time I was sort of like closing my tenure in this sort of thing. So I also after my degree, after having written for Discorder for a while, worked at Zulu Records, I got a job working at a skateboard magazine as the music editor, which I did for several years. Color magazine, anybody ever read Color magazine here? No, okay. It billed itself as a skateboard culture quarterly. I do not skate, I've never been a skater, but they hired me to edit their music section, which I did for a very small amount of money for a number of years. And the last major piece that I ever wrote for Color, which I think was in 2009 or 10, was this interview with Destroyer that you see on the right. Yeah, the stuff I was just talking about is sort of how I ended up going to grad school and becoming an art critic, because I realized at some point that I really wasn't making any money writing about music, or like the amount of money I was making was extremely small. And so I determined, okay, well, this isn't actually going to be a real job or a living for me, and I don't, as much as I enjoyed working in a record store and writing about music for a small amount of money, maybe I didn't want to do that forever. And so I thought, okay, I'll go back to school and focus more of my attention on art. Though at the same time, over the same years I had been doing this, incidentally, I also, while I was working at the record store, also got a job working at a bookstore, Pulp Fiction Books in Vancouver. And here you can see my old boss, Christopher Brayshaw, who is still the proprietor of this, I should say, wonderful establishment that you should definitely visit if you're ever in Vancouver. Anyone here ever been to Pulp Fiction Books? Yay! So Chris is a very cranky man, but he's also kind of a polymath. In addition to running this bookstore, he has written about art quite extensively. He is an eccentric stock investor and mountain climber, but he also runs a contemporary art space upstairs from the bookstore called CSA Space. So by the time that I had gotten the job at this bookstore, I had been much more attentively going to contemporary art venues in Vancouver, and I had started to sort of write about art a little bit on my own blog and for some other blogs, because it was a great era of blogging. And so I was also reading a lot about art at this point. I was actually reading art magazines finally. So I had some ideas about, potentially contributing to this intellectual world. But moreover, art had also, the art world, I should say, had begun to seem to me like kind of a better version of the thing that I had been after all along, which was a social arena for thinking about, for debating the use and the meaning and the value of cultural artifacts. And so I really, for reasons that I will expand on in a moment, I really thought of contemporary art as a sphere of intellectual activity, as a sort of space of discourse, if you will. I think my desire for this kind of space can be traced directly back to the sort of cultural vacuum that I grew up in. And even my specific interests with regard to contemporary art, I think also go back to this original epiphany of file sharing and the kind of 90s internet, which is how to deal with the volume of cultural artifacts that exists via the internet, and how to deal with the potential for delocalized, decentralized relationships with other people and things. And then especially also the revolution in the economy of culture that is made possible by digital dematerialization. So to back up a minute again, with regard to what I was learning in school and what I was writing about at the point where I kind of fancied myself a critic and was trying to sort of turn myself into one. In terms of music criticism, I was totally obsessed with Lester Bangs for a number of years, who, as you may know, has a really sort of like gonzo, all-out style of writing about music, which by the time I eventually developed a style was quite different from the way that I wanted to write. But I was so impressed by his charisma. And kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum, I was also blown away by Susan Sontag's clarity and sort of intellectual rigor, her sort of commitment that felt political even when she wasn't always talking about politics. At the same time, Carl Wilson's Let's Talk About Love, which is, you may be familiar with these 33 1/3 books, which are books by noted critics and journalists on the subject of a single album. And Carl Wilson, who is maybe Canada's most prominent music critic, was then and still is now, wrote his installment in the 33 and a third series on Celine Dion's Let's Talk About Love. And his whole argument was, this album is generally considered bad. You know, serious music critics are not interested in talking about pop music, which is a thing that was maybe true at the point when he wrote it and is dramatically less true now. But he was one of the people that was sort of involved intellectually in really democratizing the enterprise of music criticism. Some people eventually called that movement poptimism, with the idea that, you know, writing about music or culture or art in general is not necessarily about finding the thing that is the most cool, the most avant-garde, the most cutting edge, but thinking about what people do with cultural artifacts. You know, what is it good for? Who is interested in it, and why are they interested in it? What kind of pleasure do they get out of it? And all of those are really valid questions, which really kind of changed the way that I think about criticism in a fairly major way. It's also a really quite solid entry-level primer on aesthetic theory from the 18th century to the present. And he's especially good on Pierre Bourdieu, who I had to read in my seminars and I didn't understand. And then I read Carl Wilson on Pierre Bourdieu's notion of cultural capital, and I was like, oh, okay, that makes a lot of sense. That's what the whole book is about. An older work like Dick Hebdage's Subculture, you may know Dick Hebdage as the Dick in Chris Krauss's I Love Dick, which is also a wonderful book that I didn't read till much later. But you know, that's a foundational cultural studies text on the meaning of style, as the subtitle will tell you, which for me, when I was maybe like, I don't know, 23 or 24, the meaning of style, I can learn that? Unbelievable. Also Walter Benjamin, being introduced through seminar classes, through largely art history classes, to Frankfurt School theory and the roots of cultural studies, which is essentially like, you know, Frankfurt School theory is the origin of, not the origin, but, you know, a major text of Western Marxism, and thinking in Marxist terms about cultural objects rather than just about social movements. And so I learned essentially like a Marxist approach to cultural criticism from reading Benjamin's essays like Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, or Technological Reproducibility, as most people translate it these days. And the author as producer, they're so good. And then also at the same time learning about social art history and art historical Marxism from writers like T.J. Clark, whose Painting of Modern Life I had to read for Marie and Ryan's really wonderful class on 19th century art at UBC. Likewise, I mean, I had really great teachers at UBC, people like John O'Brien, whose class on Canadian art I took, William Wood, who is an interesting character that was not always liked by everyone, but was a very influential teacher for me. And Charlotte Townsend Galt, who I took a methods class with. All of these people were fantastic. And so the reason that I have these three books here is, especially in William Wood's classes, I read almost nothing but stuff taken from October magazine. For me, learning about contemporary art was almost just like reading October magazine. And unlike many people who probably hated it, I loved it. I think I said to my editor, Skye Gooden, one time that I might be the only person that ever like wanted to be Benjamin Buchloh, which I hope I've gotten over. But yeah, I remember reading specifically the title essay, or no, not the title essay, This Funeral is for the Wrong Corpse, from Hal Foster's Design and Crime, which I think I read at a point when I really was not ready yet to understand what he was talking about, but I was so impressed by his rhetorical style and by the claims he was making, and I was so interested in the subjects he was talking about. I remember that being a really fundamental moment where I was like, oh, I just want to study this. This is what I will study in university. And also, I have Lucy Lippard's 6 Years, the Dematerialization of the Art Object here, which you can see I have a lot of Post-its in, because learning art history, especially in Vancouver, was so tied up with the history of conceptual art and with the legacy of the 1960s, especially with regard to the way that October magazine, for example, sort of channeled and reconfigured the legacy of conceptual art and institutional critique that was extremely dominant in Vancouver and really colored everything that I was learning about, especially in terms of learning about Vancouver art. And that's why I also have Melanie O'Brien's Vancouver Art and Economies there, which I think was definitely published after my undergrad was over. I want to say 2009, but I'm not 100% sure. But in terms of encounters with big names of Vancouver art, this work of public art, Rodney Graham's Millennial Time Machine, was installed on the UBC campus in the year 2003. And I remember walking by it and just not understanding what it was. As you can see, it's kind of a modernist pavilion, glass-walled, that has inside a 19th century sort of horse-drawn carriage, and a camera obscura is built into it. And if you are able to, you can make an appointment to go in and look at it if you want, which I never did, and most people probably don't. But if you want to, you can go in and see reflected on a little silk screen the image that the camera obscura is pointed at, which is a redwood tree on campus at UBC in a significant spot as well. I should clarify exactly what that is. It's a sequoia, actually. And it's located behind the recently constructed Indian Residential School History and Dialogue Center. So this was chosen for a very particular reason. But circa 2003, when I had basically just taken my first Intro to Art History course, I did not understand how to appreciate this work of art. And I felt like I didn't need to go to university to study music. I could read my music criticism, I could listen to music and appreciate it. Same thing even for literature. I felt like I could read a novel, I could read most kinds of books and just appreciate them. Same thing that I did study film studies at university, but I still felt sort of confident in that I could just watch a movie. But when it came to contemporary art, I felt like kind of at sea. I was like, I don't really know what I'm looking at. And so a lot of, not everyone, of course, but lots of people sort of come to art via being exposed to it in their youth or just having a great love of art. And I feel like I came to art by being frustrated and confused by it and wanting to figure it out in a way. This piece is perhaps more opaque than most, but I think just seeing it on campus was kind of formative for me. And also, one of the classes I was in took a tour and told us a little bit about Rodney Graham and the history of Vancouver photoconceptualism, and I was kind of left scratching my head. And so I wanted to figure out what it was all about. And in a way, that particular era of Vancouver art kind of haunted me for years. And I think I've gotten over that. But at the same, roughly around the same time, the Morris and Helen Belkin Gallery at UBC had amazing programming. And I often think about two exhibitions that I saw there, both in the year 2002. Rebecca Belmore had a show there that I think was, I forget the actual title of the exhibition itself, but this now very famous, it's shown as a video installation. It was originally performed as a performance, titled Vigil, I believe, but is now usually seen in the form of this video installation that was recently shown at the AGO, The Named and the Unnamed, which is a performance that she did that is a memorial for missing and murdered women in Vancouver's downtown east side. And I was really moved by it when I saw it in 2002, and I was like, okay, this is something contemporary art can do in forms like performance and video and installation, and which, in the form of a work like Rodney Graham seemed kind of opaque to me, was really illuminated, though I actually saw this exhibition before I saw the Rodney Graham thing. But nevertheless, it eventually all came together in my mind. The sort of power that these forms could have was really illuminated for me by seeing this work in this exhibition. Likewise, Andrea Fraser had an exhibition that was actually just called Exhibition in 2002 that did not actually include this piece, though in a seminar I took with William Wood, he showed Official Welcome. And Andrea Fraser, as many of you probably know, is one of the major figures of institutional critique and produces work that is often directly critical of museum and the museum and gallery structure, institution, infrastructure. Official Welcome is about a half-hour performance that's recorded on video, in which she sort of performs the rituals of welcoming people to art shows. And it starts out where you think, like, oh, she's just saying thank you to the curator here at this opening of hers. And then she starts sort of using a different voice and speaking in a different manner. And she does this several times until you realize she's performing several different roles, where she enacts sort of the gracious curator, and then like the obnoxious macho male artist, then sort of obsequious artist. And she ends, and as the performance goes on, she eventually takes off her clothes and ends up in just her underwear, saying that I am not a person right now, I am an object in an artwork. And I was also really blown away by that when I first saw it, as a piece of theater, essentially. Performance, installation, video, institutional critique, what I was really being exposed to at this point in my education was the power and the potential of critical art. And I think that I really came to this understanding of contemporary art as a critical enterprise, which appealed to me aside from its own, autonomous power. It appealed to me for the way that I could see that the operations of contemporary artists, particularly at this moment in history, seemed functionally similar to me to the operations of a critic. That what both critics and artists were doing was researching and analyzing and criticizing the way that ideology operates in culture. And especially, again, in circa the early 2000s, contemporary art really felt to me, and I think was in a lot of ways, grounded in a rigorous method and a body of scholarly knowledge, which is to say theory, basically. Postmodern and post-structural theory, post-colonial theory, queer theory, but also all the other things that I had been mentioning prior to that in this talk. That facilitated the academicization of both criticism and of art, but it made art something that you needed to study in order to understand, or at least that's what I felt, that I needed to study art in order to understand it. And so I had kind of mixed feelings about the exclusivity that this entailed, and I still do. In a way, I saw music and subculture as something that was more accessible, more democratic, even if it was exclusive in its own way. But on the other hand, I appreciated the way that contemporary art valorized education. It's not easy to understand how ideology works, and you need to develop you need tools in order to develop critical thinking, and to do that you need, in a sense, you need to study, basically. And so contemporary art was really wrapped up for me in education, and pedagogy was also a very current topic in the art of the mid-2000s. So right around the time that I was finishing up my undergrad, and working those various jobs I had just described to you in Vancouver, Philip magazine started publishing. Philip was published in Vancouver by a group of people including Jonathan Middleton, Jordan Strom, Jeff Consardi, Christina Podesva, from 2005 to 2015. And it was, I would say that it drew on Vancouver's sort of orientation towards being intellectually rigorous without being beholden to the kind of insular local canon that was established in Vancouver. It was much more outwardly looking, internationally connected. It was allied with platforms like Eflux Journal, which was kind of emerging around the same time, and it was focused on a younger generation of artists and curators. Like Eflux, it was also participated a lot in the focus on curatorial issues and curatorial theory. And I remember when I first encountered it, I was kind of put off by its sort of heavy-handed, what I considered kind of pretentious presentation. For example, Philip never had images on the cover, and they didn't really have a lot of images inside either, which again, initially kind of annoyed me, but I learned a lot from reading Philip, and I eventually became very, not conducive to, but I feel I was, Philip was quite influential on me, even though I never contributed to it. I did write a kind of review of Philip for Discorder under a pseudonym, in which I was like kind of I'm very embarrassed of this review now because it really exposed me as a person who didn't know what he was talking about. Not at that point anyway. But these works that you see on the right are part of a project that Christina Podesva, who was a contributing editor to Philip, was doing as part of her MFA at UBC, basically right around the time I had finished my undergrad and was, trying to become involved in the art scene. And so Color School was an educational social project. It was essentially kind of like a work of relational aesthetics where she ran a sort of do-it-yourself free school that was themed around color. And kind of, as you can see by the colors that she chose, which are red, white, black, yellow, and brown, there was a sort of, it was an investigation of race, essentially, but only in a very, very low-key, kind of not upfront kind of way. But basically anybody was allowed to come to, not allowed, encouraged, invited to come to Color School and present some kind of knowledge that they had. And so on a number of occasions, Christina and I ran some listening labs together where we got together to listen to music based around particular colors, which was an interesting experience. It was one of the only times I've ever sort of been involved in an art project in this way. And I had sort of mixed feelings about the level of success that we achieved with that, but it was fun. And this particular issue of Philip here, incidentally, that you see on the left, has an essay by Christina called A Pedagogical Turn, Brief Notes on Education as Art. And so Christina was quite active, and rereading some of these essays recently, they're really good. They really stand up, even though the context has changed quite a bit. But at this moment in art, relational aesthetics was still a major going concern, and there was a lot of participatory social practice being considered and being produced. And so I feel like this is also, in a way, kind of tied in with my experience of Vancouver, but was also internationally current at the time. Another book here that was really major for me was Sven Ludekin's Secret Publicity, which also has Andrea Fraser on the cover. And the main topic of a lot of the essays in that book is about the art world as a sphere of public discourse, as a public, and the way that art sort of assembles groups of people to think about things, which was really how I wanted to see the art world at the time. And Claire Bishop, as a critic that I really looked up to for many years and still do, after having read her criticisms of relational aesthetics that she published in various places, Artificial Hills came out in 2012, and by that time I was already starting my PhD. But I read a lot of Claire Bishop in the mid and late 2000s. And that was around the time that I moved to Toronto to start a master's in art history at York University. And when I initially pitched to the master's program, what I wanted to write about was I had the idea that I was going to write a thesis on the use of and the reference to popular music and subculture in contemporary Vancouver art. So there's precedence for that in Rodney Graham's work. Even Jeff Wall has done some works that sort of depict music. And of course, Jeff Wall and many of the leading figures of Vancouver photoconceptualism were in a band called You Jerks in the late 70s. But in terms of artists that were working at that time that I was thinking of Tim Lee, Kevin Schmidt, Stephen Shearer, Con Lee, Mfanui McLeod, some others as well. And I think that this tendency was emerging out of a particular Vancouver investment in conceptualism and conceptualism's alliance with, dematerialized, distributed forms of art, and its questioning of the status of art, especially in relation to mass culture, popular culture, subculture. A question that has a lot to do with class about what art is and where art belongs. And so what I was eventually talked into doing was taking that project down to a smaller size and just making it a monographic study of the work of Stephen Shearer, which is what I eventually wrote. And I still have some regrets about never finishing that project in a way, because I think it was interesting, though also very much of that particular moment and not necessarily what I'm thinking about so much these days. My MA on Stephen Shearer, I've never really tried to do anything with it. It's not that great. But it became kind of a belated criticism for me, my like sort of last working through of criticisms of first generation Vancouver school conceptualism. And so that's what that was for me. But what I really took away from working on Stephen Shearer, and I guess I should actually say a bit about his work for those of you that might not be familiar with it. He is a Vancouver-based artist, and his work is really, it starts with a sort of archive that he has been developing for many years, which is he collects thousands of found photographs from the internet and ephemera from wherever he can get it, culled from eBay, and various other sources that have to do with especially heavy metal subculture of the 70s and popular and mass culture of the 70s, especially from the era when like music fandom had yet to be formalized in slicker ways, you know, the pre-MTV era of stuff. So he collects this stuff, and sometimes he just presents collections of ephemera, but he also uses it as the basis for archival works, for sculpture, for installation, and more recently, I would say over the last 10 years, he's mostly focused on painting. So I was interested in his archival work, the idea of like a sort of public archive that he was working with. But what really became apparent to me while working on this topic was just the inescapability of the internet, that if you want to talk about a public archive, if you want to even talk about photography, circa this particular time in history, you have to talk about the internet. And so increasingly, it was the internet that I was focused on. And also, I mean, it's worth saying that in the time between when I finished my undergrad and started grad school, social media really like took off. I got my first smartphone at almost the exact same time that I started grad school. I got a Tumblr. But more about the internet shortly. I don't have that much time left, do I? 10 minutes or so. But yeah, so I also started writing art criticism professionally, finally, around this time, sort of towards the end of my MA. And I kind of quit writing about music at this point and became totally focused on writing about art. So one of the first pieces that I ever published and got paid for was in C Magazine, 2010, issue 108. And I reviewed a video projection series that they had at the MAC here in Montreal that was called Music Video, and showed a bunch of videos by artists concurrently with, like video art by artists concurrently with music videos made by artists. And I thought it was interesting that they really didn't make a distinction between those two things, even though they're meant to operate in different contexts. There's a piece about Jessica Eaton that I wrote for Black Flash, also in 2010. I interviewed Sherry Boyle for a magazine called Bad Day. I published an interview with Stephen Shearer in Bad Day as well. And that was the beginning of my writing art criticism professionally. I also, I had a publications internship at the power plant in 2010. And I feel like that was a useful experience. I had about as good an experience as an intern as you can have. They actually let me do writing and research and never asked me to get coffee. But yeah, and so that takes me to what I have actually been doing as a critic for the last almost 10 years, which is really a whole separate other talk. But again, to sort of emphasize, I feel like there was sort of a historical break between art as I understood it during the whole time when I was in university and learning about art, and then art since I've actually been a practicing critic. For example, the year 2008 was the major financial crash, and really around the same time, the iPhone was introduced and became general. And I think that the legacy of that financial crash in 2008 and the sort of reverberations it's had throughout capitalism are really tied to the emergence of social media and digital technology and its kind of permeation into all aspects of our lives. And Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism came out in 2009. It was another book that just had a massive impact on me. Mark Fisher was also, I was reading his blog religiously well before he published this book, because for those of you that don't know, he was a British music critic and cultural commentator who always had such incredibly excellent things to say about music, but was also really a broad-based cultural critic and a really eloquent writer about late capitalism and about the sort of psychopathology of late capitalism. I feel like he was, immediately after the financial crash, he was really eloquent at writing about how it both presented an opportunity for advancing a much more aggressive, progressive vision of society in the wake of sort of like the discrediting of the neoliberal establishment, but at the same time, just the way that capitalism closes down alternatives, that it installs itself as, not necessarily the best system that makes people the happiest, but just the only possible one, as if there was no other way to live. I still think about Mark Fisher all the time. He very tragically committed suicide last year. But I have a lot of other slides. And only about 5 more minutes officially left in this talk, so I'm going to kind of buzz through some stuff. Also around the same time, 2008, 2009, 2010, I got a Tumblr, and that is not anything particularly impressive, but it really filtered how I was experiencing and engaging with art at the time. It was the period between like 2009 and 2012. I saw the discourse around post-internet art begin to emerge, primarily just on Tumblr through artists that I was following on there. And it seemed like a really generational moment for me. Up until that point, my engagement with contemporary art felt quite beholden to the past in a lot of ways, especially the legacy of conceptual art. I felt like it seemed to me that contemporary art was in many ways all post-conceptual art. And when I was encountering the artists that I was, via Tumblr within this scene, I felt like this was a complete renewal of that history. I was like, this is our moment. This is the art of my generation. And so I became kind of a participant observer of projects like the jogging. And I remember being, very excitedly following documents like Artie Vierkant's The Image Object Post-Internet, and the whole sort of like intellectual scene that was developing around these artists and this kind of work. I have a lot of notes, but I'm just gonna, in 2010, I traveled to New York to see this show at the new museum called Free, which seemed to me, and I think was kind of the first major museum moment for post-internet art, even though the term wasn't really being used at the time, and they definitely didn't use it anywhere in the materials for that show. But I think the thing about the way people were talking about the internet and art at that time was very hopeful and excited. The idea that social media was really going to revolutionize the way we consumed and produced art in a way that would be, hopefully all to the greater good, that it would decentralize, that it would really decrease the power of major museums and galleries and increase the power of artists and audiences. And the title of Free itself kind of hints at this idea of liberation and emancipation that for me kind of harkened back to the promises made by 60s conceptual art and renewed them for a new era. Seth Price's Dispersion, which is an artist's book that he started making in 2002 and finished in 2008, was a major inspiration for Free, and I think for a lot of the artists in this scene as well. And that he was writing about distribution rather than production being the primary way that artworks accrue meaning, and that artists needed to find ways of harnessing communication networks and really thinking about how their work was going to be distributed and disseminated, and how artists needed to harness networks, basically. And so this is something that I felt like I was quite invested in at the time. And so the first piece that I ever wrote for Canadian Art Magazine was a review of an exhibition that John Raffman had at the Angel Gallery in Toronto. And I was really enthusiastic about it. I felt like John Raffman's work really, in the series 9 Eyes of Google Street View, which many of you are probably familiar with, in which he went into, Google Street View was still pretty new at the time. I think it was introduced in 2007, and he started this series in 2009. And, he would go throughout Google Street View and just find interesting images. Essentially, Google's, I feel I'm not sure I need to explain this work. How many of you know this work already? Yeah, okay. So yeah, this was shown at the Contact Photography Festival, and in 2010, yeah. The theme of the festival was public, and me at the time, I was like, yeah, you couldn't be more appropriate for the theme of public and publicity than this particular series. The way that it sort of captured how the internet was making everything public, information, images, actual geography was all being made public. And I thought Raffman's work really aptly captured both the sort of anxiety about that, the fact that everything is surveyed, but also the sort of like sublime possibility of like, wow, you can see everything in a way, the positive and negative sides of that. And so between 2012 and 2014, I wrote a fair bit for Canadian Arts and some stuff for Border Crossings and Magenta. I wrote a catalog essay in 2012 that, thinking back now, was kind of formative for a lot of stuff that I've done since then. It was for a show called Transform, Matter as Subject, and it was about how I felt that at the time artists were, the show was about matter and materiality. The artists working in it were mostly working in abstraction, and they were making objects. They were interested in objecthood. And I felt like a lot of artists were working in this mode, and there was sort of a widespread turn away from the sort of post-conceptual art that I had kind of like grown up with up to that point in a way. And so this catalog essay was my first time sort of writing about that shift that I think in many ways kind of characterizes the whole last decade. I'm not going to say too much about it because I'm really running out of time here, but the following year I wrote a catalog essay for Zin Taylor, and both of these essays were kind of colored by my interest, my then emerging interest in object-oriented ontology. I was in an OOO reading group in Toronto with a bunch of other people, and it was sort of influenced, I quoted Bruno Latour in my essay for Transform, and then my essay for Zin Taylor was really all about a book that Ian Bogost had written called Unit Operations, and I really was just writing about how his idea of object-oriented ontology through unit operations was related to Zin Taylor's work. And it is it's one of the essays that I've written that like leans the heaviest on a particular kind of theory that I have eventually come to almost completely lose interest in. So an artist actually that I know posted this on Facebook the other day, and I was like, oh, I should use this for something. But yeah, I feel like I really invested a number of years in thinking about things and materiality in a way that it's not completely worthless. But I eventually realized that I couldn't do anything with this theory. It wasn't good for anything. But that was sort of a side note to saying that in 2014, I started writing for Momus. And that has been my primary gig since then. And I am very pleased with the work that Momus has done since then. I'm very proud and happy to be associated with the publication. And my gracious editor is sitting right here. But I would say that even if she wasn't. And so, yeah, I'm not going to, I have slides of all of the articles that I've written for Momus. But I'm not going to discuss all of these articles in detail. You can read all of them or none at your leisure. Yeah, I think there's a whole other, some other stuff that I've written, a whole other talk potentially to be given about summing up sort of the collective, because I feel like actually when I was preparing this lecture, I was like, wow, I've actually kind of been working on a continuous project the whole time, more than I realized. But that is a talk for another time. So thank you very much for having me here today. And that's it. So are there any questions? Yeah, I've been instructed to ask people to please wait for the mic, just because this is being recorded.
Thank you very much, Saelan. It's finally great to hear you talk about your practice as a practitioner rather than just reading the articles and following your work. This sounds more like a New Yorker cartoon joke where it's actually a statement framed as a question, but there is a question at the end. And as you were describing kind of your, how you became a critic, one of the things I've noticed, or the connections that I made between what you were describing in terms of your formative, the books that were the formative artifacts in your development, was this idea of, you mentioned Benjamin's Illuminations, but also because your focus is very much on dematerialized practices and internet practices or even ephemeral practices. In a sense, you're less a traditional critic than you are a flaneur of the cultural landscape and the cultural artifacts. Do you think of yourself that way, or do you?
I would be very embarrassed to call myself a flaneur, but I mean, I see what you're saying. Yeah, and in a way, I mean, definitely coming from the background that I do as a music critic, I've always kind of, the people I've admired the most are sort of generalists, not art critics who write for a general audience, but generalist critics, people who write about everything. And I don't actually write about everything to the same extent. You know, I don't write about film. I don't really write about music anymore. I've written exactly one essay that was published about literature. But yeah, that's sort of what I aspire to in a way. Even when I'm writing about art, it's something that embarrasses me a bit, that I have this compulsion to always try to want to, like, write about the zeitgeist. I think that, you know, to the extent that I succeed at doing that, I think it does. I don't know. I don't want to start bragging about my work, but I feel like it's both the thing that I am the most proud of and the most embarrassed of in my work, that I always feel compelled to try and do that. So, you know, lots of times I do just sit down and write an essay about an artist whose work moves me, but yeah, definitely I do have an orientation towards culture in general.
Great, thank you.
Hi, Saelan.
Hi, Scott.
This is a great talk.
Thanks.
What a compelling trajectory. I was just curious if you could speak a bit about the aspect of becoming a writer, and when you figured out you had a voice, how did like the mechanics of becoming a good critic on the page materialize for you? Was it something that came quite naturally, or did you have to work quite hard at it in order to arrive at the voice that you now obviously espouse with such confidence?
Well, thank you. I guess I always kind of knew that I wanted to be a writer. Like definitely, you know, what I was saying in terms of my attraction to criticism in general, my idea even from, you know, my late teens, that I kind of wanted to be a critic, which I think is not a common desire. But yeah, I don't know how oftentimes when I go back and read, I guess I was always just like amazed by writing throughout my education. That was what excited me. And so how did I get to, I don't know. I mean, this really sounds like I'm boasting, but when I read stuff that I wrote when I was much younger, I often feel that it's better than what I write now. I feel like, especially as a music critic, I was so susceptible to enthusiasm. And I feel like my writing about art these days doesn't always have the same degree of really like fervent enthusiasm that my music criticism did. And so it's fun to go back and read those things where I was just like swept up in a religious fervor by how amazing this was and how you had to hear it. And I feel that I tend to be a bit more, I don't know if dispassionate is the right word, but I tend to be a bit more detached when I'm writing about contemporary art these days. Part of which is just that I'm not as young as I used to be, maybe.
Hi, I was wondering, I would be curious to hear more about your experience as being involved from the beginning of kind of the post-internet art craze to coming towards the end and actually writing an article about calling for the end of it, and how that was as an experience?
Well, I mean, I was never that involved, you know. I was always like just sort of watching it happen. And when I started my PhD, actually, I started it with the intention of writing sort of backwards to the 60s from post-internet art and doing a sort of history of networked culture in terms of, you know, sort of the excitement I had experienced around post-internet art and connecting that back to the whole history of dematerialization. And I'm still working on that. I thought I would finish it a lot sooner. And so definitely, by the time I ever get to finishing it, it will be like historicizing rather than, you know, writing about it in the moment. I've also never been, you know, especially, you know, living in Montreal for the last 6 years. You know, post-internet art is a fairly distributed phenomenon in many ways, but it's still a lot of like the bigger names associated with it are based in New York or Berlin. And I'm not like personally friends with them, so I have never annoyed anyone enough to have it like affect me socially, or, you know, vice versa. But definitely I feel like the major story for me in my art writing, you know, the second lecture that I didn't get to talk about is sort of going from the excitement of like, wow, anything is possible, to sort of watching those possibilities close down. And a lot of even like the actual aesthetics of post-internet art be taken up by like the alt-right. And the way that the internet has just become a feeding ground for right-wing extremism that's actually kind of endemic to Silicon Valley culture in a lot of ways. I'm reading a great book right now by a guy named David Columbia called The Politics of Bitcoin. That's about how prevalent like right-wing conspiracy theories are in Silicon Valley, basically. So yeah, also, you know, I think, you know, circa 2010, there was a number of people, myself included, that really thought that like market forces might be able to be displaced by the internet, or even just that the internet was in general like a force for good. And in many ways, it's turned out to be like more on balance the opposite. I think. You know, I worry sometimes that I've become like a total pessimist, like it's just poisoning our minds. But yeah, that's sort of the, thank you. That's sort of like, is that an answer to your question?
Sorry, I was struck by sort of a parallel moment in your lecture with the introduction of Napster and your sort of introduction to music, and then your introduction to Tumblr, and then your introduction to contemporary art.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if you think that parallel like continues, or has contemporary art had its Napster moment?
That's a good question. I mean, yeah, sort of in a way, like that was it. I mean, there was also, of course, internet art of the 90s. And I feel like there's a lot to be said about the sort of distinction between internet art of what I think is basically like the distinction is internet art of the dial-up era and then internet art of the broadband and social media era, which a lot of people would like to talk about as a continuum, but I think are really, really different things. But yeah, I think, you know, post-internet art was contemporary art's Napster moment in a way. But also, honestly, my dissertation is about how this phenomenon seems to work in bubbles. There's constantly these bubbles about the liberating, emancipating effects of dematerialization. Like if we can only get rid of the physical thing, then everything can slide, or like, you know, intellectual ideas can be exchanged completely transparently. And that's actually never the case. Like there's always like material translators that have to happen. There's always a back end that has to be accounted for. Whether we're talking about like, you know, the physical servers the internet is based on, or the economy of who owns everything. There's always the actual stuff that has to be reckoned with in the end.
And this is kind of a follow-up question, because clearly you have an interest in archives of different kinds.
That's true.
So I'm curious how, and if archival theory factors into your practice, or if you're interested in other artists like Shearer who work with archives, and how you respond to the archive, whether it be physical or digital.
That's a very good question. I feel like I never had a, for example, when I was thinking about like what I needed to read for my comprehensive exams, I was like, do I need a section on archival theory? And I didn't do that, actually. I never like read a section on archival theory, though I've read many things that are sort of generally associated with that. And I feel like maybe you're Hal Foster's essay on the archival impulse. I feel like that really characterizes. I feel like, the archive was kind of my focus of interest before the archive got eaten by the internet in a way. But the archive as a topic of inquiry in itself is still, very interesting for me. Though I haven't really gone back to think about it sort of in isolation in some time. But now I might, so thanks.
Big topics and big themes. I want to return to Damien's question, if you don't mind, about your flannery. The presentation was very much about a kind of regional style, or your encounter with photoconceptualism and what was going on in BC, and this was informative for you in a really obvious way. Maybe this would be an opportunity to talk about what you've been doing with MOMIS and in Montreal. Have you identified comparative regional styles here, or recently you wrote about DIY culture in Montreal? What's been your sense as a flaneur in Montreal of what's going on here?
Well, one of the reasons that Vancouver photoconceptualism is so tenacious is that it has so many archivists. But it's also, I honestly didn't expect it to loom so heavily in this talk, but I guess it was like a really big thing for me. Most places don't have a regional style as well defined as Vancouver does, even if, Vancouver's been kind of over it for at least a decade. What Quebec does have is a very strong legacy of formalism and abstraction that I think is not always of the greatest relevance for artists working today, but definitely is still very palpable in a lot of ways. And it's something that I feel kind of like a tourist in, I don't feel very comfortable speaking to a regional style in Montreal. I don't know that there is one. I remember, a number of years ago, I wrote a series of things about Julie Favreau, and I made some sort of tentative claims that video was a very strong force in Montreal. I don't know if that's really true or not, because it's a very strong force everywhere. I don't think it's definitive of anything. But I think that also regional styles have become incredibly decentralized, because everybody, I was talking about how the internet has not accomplished decentralization in a lot of ways, but it has actually contributed to, I think, an increasing homogeneity of art between different places, because I like to use the term screen facing. I think a lot of art these days is screen facing. And there are certain things that work really well in that format and certain things that don't. So that's that.
How are you doing? Can you take a couple more questions?
Yeah, sure.
Have we got a couple more questions? Okay, I do. Stephen, the work on Stephen Shearer, you focused on the internet. I read something not so recently by, what's her name, Sarah something or other. She was like one of 5 Globe and Mail art writers that ever had a full-time.
Sarah Milroy?
Sarah Milroy wrote something on Stephen Shearer, and she said he he discovered a bunch of fanzines when he was in university, and he started doing a kind of genderqueer portraiture, like feminizing metal types and so on. This is a very different angle on Stephen Shear's work. It has to do with identity politics in his work, not his archival impulse. You seem attuned to sort of structures for the distribution of images and these big questions about how we access images. What about identity politics? Is this a direction that you see a lot of critics taking? How do you respond to that direction in contemporary art practice? Certainly it's something a lot of contemporary artists are doing.
Well, maybe I'll start by addressing Stephen Shearer's identity politics, because that is an interesting question in his work. I mean, he is a white guy, but he does, the thing about the work that I did on him is that it's, as you say, it's focused on his relationship to the legacy of conceptual art. And so I mostly write about his archival works and his text-based works. And at that point, he had done a lot of paintings, but I feel like he's really developed that side of his practice. And I was less comfortable writing about, and honestly, I still am less comfortable writing about painting most of the time. But even in his more conceptual works, he actually does have some very interesting identity politics things going on in terms of masculine identity. And different perspectives to take on masculine identity and how the theatrical nature of metal performance was one of the only outlets for especially working class men in like the 70s and 80s to express non-normative masculine attitudes. So that's something I write about in there. In terms of writing about identity politics generally, I am aware that I have not exclusively, but really primarily written about white artists. And this is something that is a problem for me. And the difficulty I always run into is not wanting to speak for someone else, while also wanting to address someone else. And this is something I actually want to think about a lot more in my practice as a critic. It's a topic that I really haven't sufficiently addressed for myself, what I need to exactly do about it. And I knew it would come up eventually. So, thank you.
It was wonderful in the presentation that a woman of color, Rebecca Belmore, an Indigenous artist, and Andrea Fraser, directed your own. Oh, sorry. Yeah, you said they made sense of Rodney Graham for you, so these people have mattered for you as guides, even if you haven't.
Yeah, for sure.
Are there other questions?
Yeah,
Yes,
I've got a microphone here already.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, you've presented yourself as somebody who came to art through criticism, I believe, and came to culture through criticism primarily, through reading about it and then exposing yourself to the experience of it. Do you think that has had an influence on the type of work that you focus on as opposed to having perhaps come to criticism through art, if that makes sense?
Hey, bud.
Hi.
Totally. Yeah, that's had a huge influence on the kind of work that I like to look at, or that I have looked at. I can only agree, really. I think that if I had come to art from art practice, I probably would have come in a different way. And a lot of critics do, actually. But yeah, I'm definitely attracted, and I think I was saying this at one point, that I'm attracted to artists that work kind of like critics in a way, and that sort of perform critical operations. I used to joke that I like books about books and art about books and books about art. Anybody else?
Thank you.
Oh, can I ask one more?
Sure.
Could you say something about your dissertation research? And maybe this is a really inappropriate question because you still have to defend and it's a stress-inducing thing to think about finishing the dissertation, but you're writing on anxiety as a key kind of affect in contemporary art. And
That is a talk that I just gave last week at UAC, and it does figure into my dissertation a bit. Is that what you wanted to ask me about?
Yeah, sort of. You're very good with big frames on contemporary art, and this is a compelling one, and one we've been discussing a lot in the seminary, or in the seminar, affect theoretic approaches to contemporary art, dominant affects.
Yeah, I have been reading a lot more in affect theory, kind of belatedly. And part of it is, I mean, if you look at the things that I've written in the last year, I'm just kind of depressed. And so I want to, think about it and use it in a way. But I feel like I'm not alone either. I think it's a very distributed affect, if you will. I think that the world is very anxiety-inducing for a lot of reasons, economic, ecological, political. It's hard to look at the future and feel great about it. And so obviously that colors, the kind of art that people are producing and the way people are talking about it. That's not a major facet of my dissertation, such as it is. But yeah, something I talked about recently and I've written about a bunch. Probably will write about some more.
You know what? Cures for anxiety. Let's head for a drink.
Hey!
And say thank you that way. But first, a round of applause.
Well, thank you again for having me. Thanks to everybody for coming. I appreciate it a lot.